Hundreds of years ago, Arab traders saw an emerald cloud far out in the Indian Ocean. Below it lay a mysterious island they called Aldabra, the Green. Aldabra was the start of a magical voyage of discovery. Floating in these waters was an enormous nut, which seemed to come from a tree growing somewhere in the deep. Later, the sailors discovered more islands, and when they looked beyond the beautiful beaches, they stumbled upon a lost world of ancient forests and extraordinary animals. From delicate miniatures to armored giants. These are the exotic inhabitants of the Seychelles, small islands with big stories to tell. How did these strange creatures come to be here, in the middle of the ocean? In the Middle Ages, sailors found these titanic nuts washed up around the Indian Ocean. They named them coco de mer, coconuts of the sea, because they seemed to come from the ocean itself. This erotic appearance led to rumors of a Garden of Eden nearby. But was there any truth to these stories, or were they just travelers' tales? 1,000 miles of ocean lies between the Seychelles and the African mainland. So what makes these tropical hideaways so special? The answer lies in the distant past, with a riddle that begins high in the misty forests of the Central Islands. This is one of the smallest frogs on Earth. Even an ant looks menacing in comparison. But the tiny gardener's frog is one of the biggest clues to the Seychelles' history. Unlike most amphibians, the gardener's frog lays its eggs on dry land. And the babies go through the tadpole stage before they hatch. On a small rocky island with few freshwater pools, it makes a lot of sense. After 3 to 4 weeks, the bubble bursts. Each newborn froglet is a perfect miniature, no bigger than a grain of rice. But the most amazing thing about these frogs is that they're here at all. Amphibians breathe through their skin and need to stay moist. They certainly can't have got here by island hopping. The heat and salt water would kill them. So what's a tiny frog doing in a place like this? The answer is all around, in the rocks. Granite, 700 million years old. Granite isn't found on any other oceanic island because it's usually hidden deep in the heart of continents. So, could the Seychelles have once belonged to a continent too? In fact, these rocks were part of a primeval supercontinent, Gondwanaland. But around 160 million years ago, Gondwanaland was ripped apart. As the continent split, water flooded in and formed the Indian Ocean. What is now India drifted away from Madagascar, and fragments of land were torn off and left behind. Today, these granite islands are the central Seychelles. So the frogs didn't need to travel here. They were here from the start, living among the rocky relics of vanished Gondwana land. On some of the islands, pockets of this lost world still exist. A paradise virtually untouched for millions of years. There's even a Jurassic Park of primeval palm trees. Dinosaurs once walked in the shadow of palms like these. Life here is much more varied than on other oceanic islands because a lot of it dates right back to the ancient supercontinent. It's the remains of a much richer ecosystem. Many creatures have ancestors from parts of old Gondwana land, including several camouflage experts. The tiger chameleon is related to African species, while this leaf has cousins in Asia. This exotic mix is what makes the Seychelles and their inhabitants unique. The leaf insect can drop the charade. The chameleon has its eye on something a little more manageable. Shaking his very long tail feathers is the male paradise flycatcher's way of impressing his mate. Though right now, the female isn't much of an audience. She's busy collecting spiders' webs to line their nest. Like the chameleon and the leaf insect, Seychelles paradise flycatchers have distant cousins on the mainland. But some of the plants here are in a league all of their own. These record-breaking catkins belong to the bizarre male coco de mer tree. Well over a metre long, they're the largest in the world and support their own mini ecosystem. Their flowers are packed with pollen and attract a variety of pollinators. This is where the legends of the giant nut began, and it's home to other monsters too. The Moby Dick of slugs. As long as a human hand, it spends its whole life gorging on these pollen gardens. Geckos use their famous footwork to feed on parts that others cannot reach. They stick like glue, even upside down. Which of these pollen carriers acts as a go-between from the male to the female coco de mer, no one knows. But pollination is the start of something big. This is the last stronghold of these Jurassic palms. Here they can still produce nuts of dinosaur proportions. The seeds take 7 years to mature. And when they do, they can weigh in at 20 kilos, the largest nuts on Earth. Since only dead nuts float, those washed up on other islands never produced any trees. Centuries ago, this added to the Coco de Mer's mystique. Stripped of its husk, it's easy to see why the coconut of the sea launched 1,000 sailors' fantasies. Selling the nuts helps pay for the palm forest to be kept as a nature reserve. The Seychelles were settled around 2 centuries ago, and as the human population grew, much of the original wildlife disappeared. But more than 1/3 of the Seychelles is now protected. Offshore, there are smaller islands, also made of granite. They're havens for wildlife, including huge colonies of seabirds. There are also massive numbers of lizards. More lizards per square metre, in fact, than anywhere else in the world. As many as 100,000 on one small island. The skink is another Seychelles record breaker, but it's not a relic of Gondwana land. Skinks arrived more recently and are thought to have come from the Comoros Islands 250 miles away. So, what did they do for transport? The skinks rafted in on mats of vegetation. Unlike frogs, lizards are natural sailors, able to survive at sea for days or even weeks at a time. Their scaly skins don't dry out and aren't affected by salt water. But once ashore, would they find enough to eat? Lizards do eat spiders, but that's not the secret of their success on these islands. Hundreds of thousands of noddy terns, a constant source of windfall. Skinks can only grow this big and tough around the seabird colonies. Noddy terns duck and dive above the waves. They're perfectly adapted to life at sea. But some things just can't be done in mid-air, and to breed, they have to return to land. The trouble is, webbed feet are designed for paddling, not for perching. Courtship gets off to a wobbly start. The bigger the foothold, the better. So noddies nest in the broad branches of Pisonia trees. Pisonias also have big floppy leaves for nest building. But on a small rocky island, leaves are precious. Any indecision can mean being gazumped. Noddies are clumsy builders, and their nests wouldn't win any prizes. Many eggs end up as omelettes for the plump skinks. Even if the eggs stay put long enough to hatch, the chicks are just as accident-prone as their parents. In a bad year, thousands fall out of their nest before they can fly. And once on the ground, prospects are grim. Anything that falls from the sky is food for the skinks. For noddies that do survive their upbringing, there's another threat. Pisonia seeds ripen into tiny capsules covered in sticky hooks. They velcro themselves to anything, especially feathers. These booby traps are the price the noddies must pay for their shelter and nesting materials. Now they become reluctant couriers, helping the Pisonia tree to spread its seeds far and wide, even to other islands. Of course, not every bird finishes the job. Many are crippled by the load and grounded for good. The Pisonia tree still benefits. Noddy compost helps to fertilize the thin island soil. Pisonias don't discriminate, however. Sooty terns get the same treatment, but they instinctively head for the sea to try to clean themselves. Waterlogged wings are the kiss of death, even for a seabird, as this army of ghost crabs is well aware. Every year, thousands of birds end up as crab food. If you're first on the scene, you may be able to avoid the feeding frenzy. The best way to hang on to your prize is to hide it. The beauty of the Seychelles attracts 120,000 tourists every year, considerably more than the resident population. Many people stop off at these protected islands, strongholds of the terns and other birds. As long as they keep to the paths, the birds don't seem to mind. In fact, there's one that positively welcomes visitors. For the magpie robin, opportunity knocks. The visitor's footsteps flush out insects in the leaf litter. And the robin cleans up. But who did the robin follow before there were people here? The giant tortoise. Well over a metre long and weighing as much as 3 or 4 men, the tortoise acts like a plough, exposing beetles and other tidbits for the robin. Fewer than 100 Seychelles magpie robins remain, largely because of the cats and rats that came with human settlers. But these reserves are starting to boost their numbers. It's a slow process, partly because the new generation takes a lot of time and energy. Each pair rears only 1 brood a year, and the young continue demanding food for months after leaving the nest. Giant tortoises can go without food or water for up to 3 months at a time. In the old days, this was often their downfall. Sailors stowed them on board ship as living rations. Some of the island's smaller residents become accidental stowaways. Day geckos often lay their eggs in hollow tree trunks, which may then blow down and float out to sea, carrying the next generation of geckos to an unknown destiny. In the middle of the Indian Ocean, powerful currents carry another Seychelles giant, the largest fish in the world, the whale shark. It cruises these waters to feed on the smallest of creatures, plankton, sucked into this enormous mouth and trapped in a special sieving system. Closer to shore, the hawksbill turtle, a smash-and-grab raider. It forages for food amongst the coral, crushing the harder pieces with its beak. Parrotfish are also equipped with a bony beak, but they eat the reef itself. There are lots of different parrotfish species here, some over 1 meter long. By chipping away at the reef, they reach the nutritious algae within. These chisel marks are the parrotfish's signature. Pieces of reef go in one end and out the other, and the pulverized result is a fine white sand. It's a triumph of recycling. Washed by the tide over thousands of years, the sand eventually builds up on top of the reef to form a brand new island. These small sandy islands are completely different to those made of granite. They're much younger, only 3,000 or 4,000 years old, and they have far fewer species because they were never attached to the mainland. Everything that lives here had to get here first. But the creatures that do manage the journey find a refuge. At the start of the breeding season, more than 1 million sooty terns land here, along with others who come to see the spectacle. Other ocean wanderers arrive by sea, carried in on the tide. 2 months after they were laid, the gecko time capsules are ready to open. Thanks to their seaworthy shells, geckos can colonize even the most distant specks of land. Once hatched, the baby doesn't need to feed straight away. There's still enough egg yolk in its stomach to last the first few days. Geckos are such champion colonizers that there's probably one on every palm, on every tropical island. And every tropical island probably also has a pair of fairy terns. Smaller and less gregarious than their noddy and sooty relatives, fairy terns live in couples rather than colonies, and often mate for life. Unlike the sooties, they breed at any time of the year and stay on the island all year round. Like their noddy cousins, fairy terns aren't famous for their nest-building skills. In fact, they don't bother with a nest at all. They just balance their egg wherever they can. The parents make up for their dodgy choice of location by sticking with the egg through thick and thin. Especially when the trade winds start to blow. This place is called Bird Island. Each year, more than 1 million sooty terns come here to find a mate and raise a family. It's one of the greatest shows on Earth. Each pair has just one chick to feed and protect, but they gang together to form a communal nursery on the ground. It's a kind of neighbourhood watch. But those on the fringes of the colony need to be extra vigilant. While the chicks are so small, there's always the danger of a hit-and-run attack. To a hungry egret, this must look like pick and mix. The sooty parents may not have size on their side, but they're no pushover when their chick is threatened. One attack thwarted. But there's always a next time. Fortunately for the terns, not many egrets make it this far off the beaten track. These scraps of paradise are isolated, but the most remote of all the Seychelles lies hundreds of miles to the south. It's the place that first intrigued Arab sailors centuries ago, Aldabra. Aldabra isn't made of granite or sand. It had an even more remarkable birth. It's the largest raised coral atoll in existence, 20 miles long, with a central lagoon more than 5 miles across. The atoll was once a reef that circled the rim of a submerged volcano. Time passed, and the sea level dropped, exposing the reef and creating this huge lagoon. Twice a day, the tide rushes in through narrow channels, flooding the lagoon with a fresh supply of seawater. Aldabra is made of fossilized coral, limestone, left high and dry and sculpted by the tides over tens of thousands of years. The whole island is never more than a few meters above sea level, and during its long history, it's been completely submerged several times. The last time Aldabra went under was 125,000 years ago. So everything that lives here today must have arrived since then. Aldabra's origins can still be seen today, in the ghosts of ancient corals in the limestone. It's a primeval landscape, inhabited by primeval creatures. The Aldabra rail, the last flightless bird in the Indian Ocean. It must have flown here originally, but once it arrived it had no predators, so it lost the power of flight. But how did this heavyweight get here? Thanks to their ability to survive without refreshment, giant tortoises can float at sea for weeks or months at a time. The first one to arrive on Aldabra was probably washed off a beach several hundred miles away. In theory, just one castaway could have been enough to populate the island. Female giant tortoises store sperm for up to 9 months and live to well over a century old. So a fertilized female could have started a dynasty all by herself. But even if she wasn't carrying eggs, she would only have to be joined by a single male within the next 100 years or so to get the population off the ground. Those that arrive by air can come and go as they please. Crab plovers congregate here for the winter. Their long, spindly legs are perfect for stalking crabs in the shallows, and ultralight for flight. Whereas these legs are built for strength, and strength alone. There's plenty of food here for tortoises, but reaching it can be a bit of a stretch. It's a risky business too. A tortoise that topples onto its back is as good as dead. Unlike females, male giant tortoises have a scooped-out shell underneath, and there's a very good reason for this. Eating may be tricky, but there's another balancing act that could be just as dangerous. Mating. Thanks to his hollow, the couple fit together like spoons. Without it, he could easily roll off and die. For baby tortoises, like most Seychelles residents, size is definitely an issue. For the first few years, they're small and fragile, and in constant danger of being eaten or squashed. Turning from this into this can take a further quarter of a century. Today, there are only 2 places in the world with giant tortoises. Around 100,000 remain on Aldabra. That's 7 times as many as the famous Galapagos population. Everywhere else, these relics have been wiped out by man. Nowadays, the tortoise's greatest danger is overheating. And once the sun gets too high, there's a rush for the shade. The amount of shade available is a natural break on the giant tortoise population. It's like musical chairs. But getting left without a seat can be fatal. Losers literally bake. Apart from bagging a shady spot, the giant tortoises have little to worry about. They're no longer killed by man, and they have no natural predators to disturb their sleep. So there's no need to tuck their heads inside their shells. Letting it all hang out is much cooler. As the tortoises doze off, a burst of activity begins around them. Hermit crabs tiptoe past to collect the fresh delivery of dung. The dung is also a magnet for flies, and flies attract another of the Seychelles fly catchers. The abbot's gecko takes up his position. Out in the midday sun, it's low tide in the lagoon. This is a good time for others to feed, including black-tipped reef sharks. It's easier to fish when the water is shallow. Crab plovers have the same idea. Soon the tide turns and starts to sweep back in, refilling the lagoon. The day cools down and another Goliath emerges, the robber crab. A kind of overgrown hermit crab, it can measure 1 meter across, and unlike its relatives, it doesn't need the protection of an extra shell. But almost all crabs must return to the sea to breed. This female land crab is clutching a parcel of eggs, but she's got a long way to go before she can release them safely in the water. As night falls, the beach is a hive of activity. Robber crabs come in 2 colors, red and blue. And they dwarf their tiny cousins. Robbers are also known as coconut crabs, because coconuts are their favorite food. Even though the packaging is a challenge. Red or blue, they soon come to blows if their meal is interrupted. As the red corner claws its way to victory, the female land crab scuttles past on her way to the sea. She has to run the gauntlet of these jousting giants if she's to give her young a good start in life. She carries the eggs beneath her, held in place by tiny clasps. They were laid about 2 weeks ago, but can't develop on land. Staggering into the ocean, the female finally opens the clasps and jiggles the eggs free. One day, they'll return to shore, and may even colonize islands of their own. Further inland, another mother has found the perfect place to lay her eggs. First, she digs a nest. Carefully scooping out the earth with alternate back legs, she creates a deep, narrow chamber. Working blind isn't easy, but giant tortoises have been doing this for millions of years. Her ancestors overcame a turbulent past, so that her young can be part of the future. A living reminder of the primeval forces that shape these extraordinary islands. Once the eggs are laid, she carefully presses the earth back down on top of them. In 3 to 6 months' time, the babies will hatch. But this is not Eden, and like their island neighbors, the youngsters will have to fight for their own survival. A new generation of giants will roam the Seychelles, and the lost continent will live on.